So thank you so much, Hung, for the much too nice introduction, but deeply appreciated. And thanks to all of you for inviting me here. It is such an honor to be here at the Tucson Festival. And of course, thank you all for coming. It is such an honor to be here today to discuss these issues with you. Now, let me just begin by being straightforward with some thoughts that maybe some of you have had as you're walking in the door. You might have been thinking, okay, Michael, we're talking about, can you hear me in the back? Oh, no, okay. Oh, should I stand here? Absolutely. Okay, well, I can stand here. How is that good? Okay, good, okay. So, let me just begin with some questions that some of you might have had when you were walking in the door, thinking, okay, we're at the Tucson Festival that's talking about the new great ideas that we should be thinking about, and here is Michael talking about ancient Chinese philosophy, and moreover, he's talking about ritual from ancient Chinese philosophy, and you might have thought, Michael, this might be kind of intriguing, kind of like, museums show Egyptian mummies, and Egyptian mummies are kind of intriguing, but if you're thinking about new ideas that perhaps should allow us to rethink the world around us, rituals from ancient China might not have been the first thing on that list. And let me just explain quickly, or pull back even to say, to discuss why one might have very reasonably thought that tonight's discussion might seem a little ill-fitting for the larger themes of this festival. And let me just lay out a common set of assumptions about the past, and especially the modern period, that might lead one to think that, again, my talk doesn't quite fit the goals of this festival. So here are some conceptions that are, I think, kind of common in the world today. We would like to say that we live in the modern world, right? That seems reasonable. And we live in the modern world, which means we don't live in the traditional world. In other words, in the world that every human being lived in for tens of thousands of years up until the modern period. And when we tell ourselves these stories, often what we will say is, the reason we're lucky we live in the modern world is we get to decide for ourselves how to live our lives. And those people stuck in those traditional societies, of course, didn't, right? They were born into traditional societies that told them what to do. And often when we tell ourselves these stories, the thing we will look to is, well, ritual is the perfect example, right? I mean, rituals tell us what to do, a part and parcel of living in a traditional world, whereas, again, if we're good modern people, we decide for ourselves what to do. So why, by definition, would we think we could learn anything from rituals? And indeed, to make it worse for my hopes of trying to convince you tonight that we should take rituals seriously, let me just mention one figure that Professor Du has mentioned already. Confucius, indeed, would say things like the following. This is actually a quotation attributed to Confucius. The way you can become a good human being is to submit yourself to ritual. It's even better. The full translation would be, you conquer yourself, you overcome yourself by submitting yourself to ritual, and then you can become good. So, kind of like exemplifies our worst stereotypes about a traditional society that, thank God, we've moved beyond. So, if that's the case, it might seem a little odd that I'm going to be talking about ritual tonight, but I am. And I am indeed not only going to be talking about ritual, I'm going to argue that we should take ritual very seriously, that it's very dangerous that we have tended not to take ritual very seriously in this so-called modern period. In fact, to make it more extreme, I'm going to argue that our whole way of thinking about ourselves as living in a modern period as opposed to some traditional society that existed in the past is not only historically wrong, it too is extremely dangerous as a way to think. And if that doesn't sound just absurd enough, let me just run farther out on the limb and say I'm even going to be arguing that our basic conceptions of the self, our basic conceptions of what it means to be a good human being, our basic conceptions of even what it would mean to have new and innovative ideas is all part and parcel of a very dangerous set of assumptions that we've fallen into that, yes, should be challenged fundamentally by, among other things, great ideas that have arisen in the world, in this case from ancient China. So that sounds like an absurd set of things to be arguing. And to set up my argument, let me begin with our conceptions today that I'm going to try to be critiquing and arguing, even though we think these to be very good, wonderful, liberatory ideas, that there's a danger set in by the very way we think of them. And so let's begin by talking about that thing I mentioned in the sort of the last of my string of points, the self. So how do we like to think about the self, especially when we're thinking about it in what we often will call the best way, which is the good modern conceptions? So here's some typical ways of thinking about the self. All of us are unique individuals. We're unique individuals because we have an essence within us, deep within us. And the way we can live a full life is to spend the first part of that life looking within and finding the self, finding one's true self. And once you find your true self, which ideally will happen around college age, right? So around college age, you're looking within, you're finding your true self. And then the hope is, once you've found yourself, you will then spend the rest of your life loving and embracing yourself for who you really are. Loving your good sides, obviously, but loving your bad sides too, because it's just you, right? And so yes, I'm a sort of person who does X, Y, and Z, and that's wonderful. But maybe I'm the sort of person who has a bad temper and little things get me really angry. But that's okay, because that's just me, and I should love myself and embrace myself for who I am. And if we do this, we often will tell ourselves, if we love ourselves and embrace ourselves once we found who we really are, if we do this, we often then will say, and then I should live my life being true to myself, true to who I really am in everything I do. So especially if you've successfully found yourself by college age, which is usually the normative goal of this, then during your college years, you think, okay, given who I am, what's the good set of careers that would fit who I really am, so I can just be myself in these careers. In fact, in the US, as many of you know very well, beginning in high school, we will even give our children tests, personality tests, that will answer this for them. It will say, okay, given who you are, these professions would be really good for who you are, because they'll allow you to be yourself. These professions would be really bad for who you are, because they would play to your weaknesses, which you should love, but nonetheless, you don't want a profession that will be playing to those. And so your whole career should be guided according to who you are. And then, of course, we use our free will to decide what that will be, and then we propel ourselves toward that career. Same thing with a partner, right? Like you want a partner who will fit who you really are. So same thing here too. We don't really take personality tests as much, but you'll often have sort of matching. It's actually on the internet they'll even do this. They'll actually have these algorithms that will match you for the sorts of people. It's like, given that you're personality type XY, you should be with personality type GH, and it'll like give you lists of people, like contact here are the GHs that will perfectly mesh with who you are. So in other words, we have this true self, you find it, and then if we embrace ourselves and love ourselves and are always true to ourselves, we guide our careers, our partners, we guide everything by it. And then we like to think if we do this, then of course we can't control everything that will happen in our lives, but at least we like to think we will live our lives on our terms by definition, and we'll live happy, liberated, fulfilled lives, choosing for ourselves what is best for us by definition, and not, again, doing things like following rituals from these traditional societies that would have told us what to do. So this is what we like to think. It's wonderful, right? I mean, this is why we're modern, and this is why we can do our lives properly, and this is why we're liberated, right? So what if we're wrong? What if not only are we empirically wrong, what if these are actually really dangerous ways of thinking? Really dangerous ways of thinking that are radically limiting what we're potentially able to do, that are actually making us being very easily manipulatable by powers that actually have a better understanding of how humans really operate in the world. And what if by telling ourselves, this is how to live a liberated lives, and telling that next generation, this is what you should do to be liberated, what if in fact we are, I'll use some strong language, tying them, limiting them to an incredibly, incredibly narrow vision of what they could become, and again, making them very easily manipulatable by powers that are now becoming incredibly, incredibly strong. So, to make the argument that maybe we're wrong with these ideas, and dangerously so, let me give you another vision of the self that you might have guessed by now arose in early China, that had an alternate way of thinking about the self and an alternate way of thinking about, therefore, what we should be doing if we're going to grow as human beings. So, in early China, would they have said, we have this true self underneath there that we're trying to look within and find? Let me tell you what the self is like, and let me also forewarn you, this is going to get really bleak really quickly, but there's good news to come, so bear with me. But here's the bleak stuff. Here's what you are. You're a messy bunch of stuff. A really messy bunch of stuff. And everyone, it turns out, is equally messy bunches of stuff. This word I'm translating stuff, there's actually a better term in Chinese for it. It's called qi, usually translated as energy. And the idea is we've got a bunch of this stuff within us, a bunch of these energies, and we've got a bunch of different faculties. We've got a bunch of things that we would call organs, but there would be called sort of the storehouses of all of this qi that's moving around, and it's a messy just bunch of stuff. And then, as human beings, these messy bunches of stuff, we enter the world and we start interacting with other messy bunches of stuff that we can euphemistically call other humans. And when we start interacting with these other messy bunches, here's what happens. We do little things that drag out from each other these different bodies of stuff. So here are some typical examples. Someone yells at me, and I'm angry. Well, in this way of thinking, someone yells at me, and that act, that yell, drags out from me this energy of anger. Hence, I feel anger. Then someone smiles at me, and I feel happy. Or in this way of thinking, someone smiles at me, and that act drags out from me an energy of happiness. Meaning, as you can see immediately, that one of the dangers, there's going to be a lot more, one of the dangers is we're totally passive. We're these passive creatures at a very young age, just immediately being affected by the world around us. That's true of messy bunches of stuff. It's true of everything. I stand in a certain way because there's a podium right here. There's a certain mood in the room that affects how I'm thinking. All the time, we are simply being pulled by immediate things around us, immediate messes, other humans, the situation, the larger context. We're utterly, horribly passive in this. That's what we're like. But then it gets worse. So we're at age, what, 1, 2? But then what starts happening is even more frightening. Because at least in those examples I just gave you, there really is someone yelling at me and there really is someone smiling at me. In other words, I'm really responding to actual things that are occurring. The bigger danger is from a very young age, we cease responding to things that are really there. We start responding by rote. We fall into habits of responding to the world. So to return to my earlier examples, someone will do something that for whatever reason emotionally reminds me of that earlier person who yelled at me. It equally drags out from me that energy of anger. Someone else does something that emotionally reminds me of that earlier person who smiled at me. It also pulls out that energy of happiness, meaning that we start responding to the world by habit, by rote. We're not even responding to the world that really exists. And if you think this is bleak, we've seen nothing yet. Because this can become so hardened that you just start responding to the world all the time like this. So we become kind of these robotic automatons, just responding to the world over and over and over again, regardless of who we're actually encountering, regardless of what the event actually is, regardless of what is happening. That's what we become as human beings. If you're thinking, okay, that's bleak, but I mean, it's not really true, is it? Let's pause for a moment and ask if maybe this point of view might be onto something. I obviously think it is, so let me just give you some examples that might kind of underline what they're saying here. So, do you have friends? I'm sure this isn't true of anyone in this room, but do any of you have friends who maybe you've seen have the same relationship over and over and over again, regardless of who they're dating? And you are friends, so you see it happening, like they'll go out on a first date, everything seems to go okay, and then the second date, you know, I think that person is really, and it's just the same old things, like, oh my God, and it's just the same thing. And it doesn't matter who they're dating. In other words, they're not relating to the other person. They're responding by rote, and it's the same things, whatever it is, the jealousies, the resentments, the angers, blah, 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 plays out, and the whole thing's a disaster. Then they meet someone else, and the same thing, and they meet someone else, and the same thing, over and over and over again. I'm sure you might have met a few friends like this. But here's where it gets really scary. Let's imagine for a moment that all of our lives are like this, that this is what we're doing all the time. Let's imagine, or as they would put it in early China, let's finally accept the fact that what we call the personality, maybe like what we call that true self that we think we should love and embrace, is simply this. That's all it is. Habits and rotes that we've fallen into from an incredibly young age, from the random stuff that we encountered as a child, that then we fell into habits of responding to that have just become part of us as human beings. What if, when we tell our children, love yourself and embrace yourself for who you are, love your strengths and equally love your weaknesses, love the fact that you love to think big, but love the fact that you've got a bad temper because it's just you? What if we're really saying, love and embrace a bunch of patterns and habits and rote responses to the world that you fell into from age 2, and love them, embrace them? Decide your career based upon them. Decide your partner based upon them. And never, ever change. Because it's you. What if this is what we are really saying to them? And I forewarned you it was going to get really bleak. Oh boy, you've seen nothing yet. So what if this is what we're saying to them? And what if then by definition, we are simply saying, stick to these rotes and patterns and never change, but note also the implication of what this would mean. The implication of this would also mean that they can become so easily manipulated because it's not some true self, it's just a bunch of rote patterns. Let me give you an example as to how chilling this can be. So, I bought a watch last week. Isn't that nice? I chose to buy a watch with my free will. I bought a watch that fit my personality based on what I like. I like a Bauhaus minimalist style because that's just me. And it fits my aesthetic, so I chose to buy this watch, right? So here's what really happened. This isn't what really happened, this is an old watch, but bear with me. Here's what really happened. So, there's a little thing called Google that does not buy into any of this idea of true self stuff. As far as I know, none of the people who've written algorithms for Google have read classical Chinese philosophy, but nonetheless, they get everything we've been talking about so far. So Google, as you probably know, and Facebook and all of them do the same thing, they have traced every single website you have ever gone to in your entire life. They have looked at every moment you go to every website in your entire life. They have found, surprise, surprise, in classical Chinese philosophy you wouldn't be surprised at all about this, that when you think you are choosing to go to this website or another website, no, you're doing it all by rote pattern. They have found out, returning to my example, that, oh, there's this guy, ZHX, they use numbers to describe us, me. I finished my last class at Friday at 2:30. At 3 o'clock, I get back to my office. At 3:01, I check the New York Times. At 3:02, I check the Guardian. At 3, they know every single thing I do. They know I'm kicking back, and it's the moment when, because I'm kicking back, I've had a long week of teaching, and I'm finally done for the weekend. And they've noticed that at 3:04, my eyes tend to be pulled to this part of the screen. This is really true, by the way. Not necessarily for me, but this is what they're charting. My eyes get to be pulled to this part of the screen. For whatever reason, at 3:04 and 28 seconds, something really red, bright, in a rectangular shape on this corner tends to pull up my eyes. They know, because they've now been doing it for several weeks, that when it pops up a little thing for me to click on, that I tend to buy it at 3:05 and 23 seconds. They know I tend to buy things that are, well, I mean, the equivalent of a Bauhaus style of favorite clothing, kind of straightforward, simple, minimalist style. And kabam, it's 3:05, 23 seconds, little red thing, my eyes go up, and there's a watch that perfectly fits the pair of pants I bought last week at 3:05 and 23 seconds, that perfectly fits the shirt I bought at 3:05 and 23 seconds the week before. I thought, oh, there's a watch that fits me perfectly. Click. Did I choose out of my free will to buy this watch because it fit who I really am? Or did a bunch of algorithms flawlessly chart all of my patterns and my rote habits and then simply manipulated me into clicking on a watch that I don't need because I've got 10 others that I don't. But but because I have 10 others at home, why did I click? Because it's 3:05 and 23 seconds and it was red and it was in that corner and I'm relaxing for the weekend. That's why I clicked. As you probably know, it isn't just Facebook and Google that do this. A lot of others do it, and they don't just do it to manipulate us to buy things. You might have heard of something called Cambridge Analytica. All of these people post-Brexit vote were asked, why didn't you vote for Brexit? And it's like, oh, I don't know, I just got really angry that day. Well, the equivalent of 3:05 and 23 seconds, blue on this corner, angry thing. All of these people from Eastern Europe taking our jobs right before they go to the poll. All of these things popping up at the right moment for the people who are perfectly poised because all of these patterns have been traced. Bam, they get angry, click, in this case, Brexit, The next day, yeah, I don't know, I was just kind of angry. Did they choose to vote for Brexit? They kind of chose in the same way I chose to buy this watch. They were manipulated because they're patterned creatures. In other words, let's pull back and lay out the possible implications of this. Number one, when we tell our children, look within, find yourself, and live your lives according to who you really are, what we're really saying, maybe, is find those patterns and rote stuff that have become so embedded in you that define what you see, how you act, what you interact with. Stick with them and never change them. And what we're telling them is become a creature whose patterns are so clear to algorithms that you will be totally manipulated by them over and over for what you buy, what you vote for, what you choose to do, you think you choose to do. In other words, have a bunch of patterns, stick to them, and allow very powerful institutions to manipulate you and control you. Happy liberation. What if this is what we're saying? Now, you might be thinking, okay, yeah, sure, I can be manipulated maybe to I click a watch, but I mean, still, I can choose not to, right? What if we can't? In other words, what if this is so embedded in what we're like as human beings, we don't notice it? Let me give you one more example. This is a chilling example. It's a few years old, so some of you might have even experienced this. I sadly experienced it after having read what was going on, so I didn't get the full experience, but it was chilling to see. Have you heard of the gorilla example? It is fascinating. So it's an experiment that was done in psychology, the gorilla experiment. So it's an experiment that was done in which people are called into a room and the experimenter walks out and says, okay, I'm gonna show you a film of some people throwing a basketball to each other, and I want you to count how many times they throw a basketball to each other. So they turn down the lights, the film goes on, and sure enough, there's some people who walk out on the court and they throw a basketball to each other, and you count the number of basketballs thrown. And then the film ends and the experimenter comes out and goes, okay, and lights come up and says, okay, how many basketballs were thrown? And people say, oh, it was 11. Someone says, no, I think it was actually 12. And they debate for a little bit as to how many basketballs were thrown. And then the experimenter says, okay, and did you notice anything else? Anything else? It's fascinating. I've been to the room. Total silence. What do you mean? What do you mean? And she says, okay, I'll show it to you again. So they showed the film again. Sure enough, the people walk out. It's the same film. They start throwing the basketballs. Then a guy in a gorilla suit walks out right in front of the camera, waves his arms like this. No one sees the gorilla. It is chilling, absolutely chilling. And translating this into classical Chinese philosophy, what is going on there is we are so defined in terms of not only how we interact, it's what we see, it's what we do, that we don't even notice it. There's a gorilla right in front of us, and we don't see the gorilla. Why? Because it's a basketball. It's simply doo, 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 doo. In other words, within 2 basketball throws, our perception is so rote that we simply go back and forth and we don't notice a gorilla. So, what if this is our life? Our life is patterned, rote responses that we are telling our children stick to, never change, and be easily manipulated by companies and states that want to control you. Doesn't sound quite as liberating, does it? So, if that is the vision of the self arising in classical China, you will hopefully be very relieved after all this bleak stuff to say they have a response to how we should therefore be growing. And it does not, and by now this would be obvious, include looking within and finding some true self. It certainly does not involve loving and embracing what you happen to be right now. It involves, well, remember that quote I mentioned at the beginning? Conquering the self, overcoming the self. The self being this bunch of rote patterns that we have fallen into that define us as human beings. And how do you do it? Well, yes, you'll remember the quote, and now let's unpack it. You submit yourself to ritual. Now, immediately you will plausibly and understandably say, well, Michael, that doesn't exactly seem to solve the problem because, I mean, wouldn't ritual just socialize us into a bunch of more patterns? So why would that be better? And isn't that kind of what Google is doing already? So if this is a problem, and I certainly think it's a problem, why would this be an improvement? Well, let's talk about what they thought about ritual. When we talk about ritual, again, with our grand modernity narratives saying that those sad traditional people used to do these rituals back in the old days, we are tending to think of ritual as simply things that socialize us into rote patterns. Well, as you can imagine in classical China, that's not how they define it. They define that as our daily normal lives. That's what life is. In classical China, they would simply say those are the habits and customs that that just become part and parcel of us as human beings. Ritual is what breaks you from all of this. Ritual is what breaks you from this stuff that you think is now you. And let's unpack how they think this works. And to do so, let me just begin with an example, and then we'll see how, in practice, this would therefore work. So, here's the example. And in this example, let's imagine that you're the king. You're the king of China. And you're the king of China for a very special reason. This being an hereditary monarchy, you are the king of China because your father just passed away. And for also the sake of the example, let's imagine you have a son who will, of course, be the king that will replace you when you pass away. So, your father's passed away. We know how difficult this is when we're dealing with death. We certainly know how it changes everything. And we know the incredible feelings of sadness, also guilt, anger, all these horrible feelings that just overwhelm us when we're dealing with the death of those close to us. We know how the entire family is sort of thrown out of whack because everyone's going through this and all the social relations are being changed. And if you're thinking in terms of the self in classical China, let's just say this would bring out the worst conceivable sets of patterned interactions you could imagine. So what do they recommend? Here's what they recommend. It's a ritual. You, remember, you're the father, and your son walk to the edge of the ritual space, and then you walk in without blushing. And that seems like a kind of odd little detail, but here's why you can't blush, because you're not you. When you walk into that ritual space, you are your son, and your son is your father. Your son, but he's not your son anymore, he's your father. He walks onto the throne and sits on the throne. He is your father, and he is your ruler. He faces south, which in classical China was the ritual direction that the sovereign looks. You, but you're not you anymore, you're the son. You look up at him, your son, but now he's your father, and your ruler. You pay obeisance to him facing north as his subject and his son. He, your son, but now is again your father, is looking down at you. And you have to look at him as if he is your father, as if he is the person who, let's probably say, you had a kind of complicated relationship with. He was your father. We know father-son relationships can get a little complicated. Mine's not. Mine's wonderful. But they can sometimes be a little complicated, particularly if you're in a relationship where he's the king and you're going to succeed him. He, your father, was probably never quite satisfied you were never good enough, right? You were never good enough to be the kind of king he wanted you to be. And you would always look at him knowing, everyone loves my dad, but I know what he's really like. I know his temper. I know what he's really like. I can be a better king. I know I can be a better king than him, but they'll never trust me because they so love him. They don't know what he's like, but they love him. And then, of course, he passes away. And all of those complex tensions can no longer be worked out. And that's why you have this incredible feelings of guilt and anger and all of these difficult tensions that can no longer be worked through. But you've got a son. That son who's going to be the future king when you die? That kid? I mean, look at this lazy kid. And everyone loves him, right? Oh, he's the cute little kid. Everyone loves him. Here's your father. Everybody loved him. They loved the son. You're the one working so hard to be the king. No one's even respecting you. They all just love the little junior here. And look at him, this lazy little kid. He's going to be the future king. In other words, all of the tensions with your father are going to be thrown onto the tensions with your son. And when I said before, things can get bleak, here's where it gets really bleak. These patterns that can dominate our lives, they pass generation after generation after generation. They don't even end when we pass away. We just pass them on to the next generation. So let's go back to this ritual. Why do you do this role reversal? With your son being your father and you being the son of your own son? Well, by now it's probably becoming clear. You are now, at the moment when you have finally come into your power, you're being forced again to be subservient. All of the feelings of responsibility and arrogance that can come with power, you're being forced to go look up at your father yet again and be subservient to him. Except it's not your father, it's your own son. Meaning, all of the patterns you're throwing back onto him, you are literally looking into the eyes of that pattern going on and on. And your son is learning from a very young age all of what you are now trying to deal with. All of that responsibility and arrogance that can come from power, because he's sitting on the throne, looking at the guy who was just yelling at him, his father, and now I'm in charge. And suddenly he sees the world from that perspective too. And each finally being forced to see the world from that opposite perspective, literally looking into each other's eyes, it finally breaks that pattern that can be passed generation after generation from father to son forever. That's how you break it. You cease to be the person seeing the world as you usually see it, repeating the same patterns as you usually repeat them, and you are forced to see the world not just from a different perspective, but from the perspective of the person in this particular relationship with whom you have the most fraught relationship, or both of them, your son and your father. You're forced to break out of your normal mode of being. Then, of course, you stand up and you walk out of the ritual. And then you're back to being you yell at the poor child again, the child yells back, Dad, well, you're temperamental again, but then you have to go back in it. And that's only one of the rituals you're doing all the time. In other words, the rituals involve constant role reversals, shifts of perspective, breaking you from being the person that you usually are and forcing you to see the world from a radically different perspective, often the most fraught perspective that you're trying to wrestle with. And if you do this, and do it properly, not blushing, in other words, really becoming that other person, what happens? Well, we've again already seen it in part by that quotation from Confucius, but let's unpack it too. You become good. Huh? Let's unpack that one too. Imagine you're doing this. Imagine, in other words, you're not simply repeating these patterns and loving and embracing these patterns. You're doing these rituals that are constantly breaking your perspectives. Where would this take us as human beings? The argument is that you are slowly beginning, and slowly meaning like literally this is a lifelong process, so I mean really slow, but over the course of a lifetime, you are not only breaking out of these patterns, you are slowly beginning to see the world as it is, a mess, a massive mess of stuff. That's what you're beginning to see the world as being. You're beginning to see the world as not this patterned, stable world that we tend to think of it as being. You're seeing it as a messy world where people have simply fallen into these patterns of stable interaction. And you begin to realize it's all changeable. You begin to realize by this constant ritual work that little things you're doing are affecting others all the time because they're patterned, right? And you're not even capturing it. So, this person's nice, that person's mean. Well, that may be an accurate empirical statement in situations where you're with these people, but of course, the question is, what are the little things I'm doing that are setting off that person's temper and bringing out better energies from this person? What are the little things I could do that could start bringing out other sides of this person? Because we're really messy, despite the fact that we become these rigid things through these patterns that define us. In other words, how, as you begin to actually operate in the world, do you cease to not simply respond by rote? How do you actually begin to sense the world around you, sense what is going on around you, sense the patterns going on around you, and sense the little things you can do to break these patterns? In other words, what are the rituals you could do when there's no ritual telling you what to do, right? Like at least with the Father, Son, there's a ritual telling you what to do. In much of life, there won't be. And that's what you're being trained to do. Let me give another example. This guy Confucius, who gave this quote that I've been referring to, so he, as you probably know, is seen as a figure who devoted his life to doing this, right? To doing these rituals, breaking these perspectives, slowly learning how to work with the world. And when we get stories of Confucius, it's always about him putatively at the end of his life doing this. So what does he do, and how is he described? Well, it's very telling. Here's a word that's usually used to describe him: joyous. Joyous. He's seen as this person who's incredibly good in any situation, from a mundane situation to a very complex situation, where he simply walks into the situation, senses all the patterns playing out, and senses the little things he can do to alter things. Literally, like a gesture, a quotation of a line of poetry, a tone of voice that will simply shift the mood of the moment and move it on to a better trajectory. Like he'll sense, this person has these patterns, this person has that pattern, they're interacting in this dangerous way, and he'll just do something to shift it. And he's seen as joyous because he's really interacting with the world. He has the joy that comes from actually sensing the world, interacting with the world, altering the world for the better, taking a messy world and shifting it into better trajectories. At a mundane level, a momentary situation, and equally, it's the same gift at a larger level, larger social and political problems. In other words, the argument is this: if there's something to this vision of psychology, and I obviously think there is, the solution being offered is ritual, but not in the way that we tend to use the word, right? Not in the way of our vision of so-called traditional societies being in which people are socialized through rituals to being a certain thing. What they mean by ritual is the training that comes by breaking your normal ways of being in the world, breaking your normal perspectives, breaking the relationships that you're in, and slowly learning that the world around you is messy, very malleable, and therefore potentially malleable in a good way, meaning you could alter it for the better. And then it's all about sensing what in the world in any given situation better would be when there's no guidelines that will tell you what that will be. You're simply trying to work with the world to create better trajectories by hopefully sensing the dangers that exist and sensing the little things we can do that can begin to alter it. And let me just conclude by making some bolder statements even than the ones I began with. So I began by saying maybe our modern conceptions of the self are wrong. Maybe the conception of the self is wrong. Maybe our self-proclaimed vision of modernity is wrong. And let me go a little bit further out on a limb yet. So I'll begin with an obvious statement. We're kind of entering some dangerous times. We are entering some times in which some very, very, very dangerous things are beginning to play out in the world. Longer term in terms of climate change, all sorts of very complex things playing out in terms of the social world, and these are now global phenomena. How do we change these? Well, it's worth asking if part of the problem is precisely this vision of the self that is allowing all of this to go on, and what would happen if we were actually, on the contrary, to start training our new generations of children and students to challenge their most fundamental assumptions about the self, about human history, about the world at large. What if instead of giving them all of our views about being sincere and embracing who they really are and the true self and all of that, what if we were actually, on the contrary, actively trying to show them in practice that there are radically different ways of thinking about the world, about the self, that ideas that are usually not taken seriously because they're consigned to the ancient traditional past are actually worth taking very seriously? What if, for example, we were to create an educational curriculum in which incredibly powerful ideas that have arisen in human history were presented not as old museum pieces that are kind of silly because they're part of a traditional way of thinking, but are actually brought out in their terrifying power in a way that could really challenge our most fundamental assumptions. And imagine, therefore, if we're training a new generation to rethink the world around them in very dramatic ways. What if, in other words, instead of trying to think, what is the great new innovative way to think, we realize humans have been coming up with some pretty extraordinary visions of the self, visions of innovation, visions of how to create a better world for, 200,000-300,000 years? And maybe, just maybe, if we dropped our grand modernity narratives, we could start looking at these, learning from these, taking these seriously, and breaking some of these fundamental assumptions that are so narrowing and limiting our potential to alter the world around us. So, yes, I think some ideas from ancient China should be taken very seriously. I think some of these ideas of ritual in particular are very fascinating and very much worth taking seriously. And if, yes, again, they challenge a lot of our basic assumptions of what it means to live a free, liberated life, well, maybe that's all for the better. Not necessarily because they are right, but that act of challenging them will break that perspective, break that assumption. It does what they would say a ritual does. It fundamentally forces us to rethink the world around us. And if we do that properly, maybe, just maybe, we could begin to create a world where future generations really could flourish. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And now let us open up for questions of any kind on any topic. Yes, please.
We have a microphone.
Oh yeah, then there is a microphone. So wait for a second or two until the microphone comes. Great, thank you.
I was wondering if you could comment on the 100 Warring Schools of Philosophy.
Yes.
And isn't that a ritual at the collective level?
Yes. Yeah, beautifully put. The answer is yes. So what is going on in this period is you are getting a series of people thinking that the world is messy, humans are messy, the world is messy, and they're trying to wrestle with, therefore, what should we do to create a better world? And I very much agree. I think a powerful way to read the early philosophical tradition in China is a series of people trying to wrestle with these implications. So I've been quoting from some text dealing with ritual theory. There's a whole nother body of text that will try to develop a whole terminology based upon what's called the Tao, which will translate very broadly as the way. And the whole sense there is think of the way as the interaction of everything meaning that little things we do literally takes us in different trajectories, and then how would you rethink the world if you thought this way? You get also the kind of, what I would say, and I suspect many of us would say, is the scary side of all this. So you get the early equivalents of Google algorithm thinkers who will, you get a whole body of political theory that will say, if humans are these creatures that fall into these patterns, what if we create a social world in which those patterns are so completely defined that people will just live their lives doing what the state wants them to do, and they'll just think it's natural, it's just them. And you get an entire vision laid out that's frankly much more scary than what Google is currently doing, worked out at a state level. Chilling. I mean, everyone should read this, because if you think what Google is doing is scary, and it is very scary, I mean, taken to the full implications, it's even more chilling. So getting back to your question, yes, I think part of what is so powerful about this tradition is if they're onto something about the messiness of the world, and I think they are, you get the different philosophers working out the implications of the powerful ways and very chilling ways that it could be thought about. And so yes, I think this should be material that literally, I'll make a strong statement again, every student growing up in the world should be reading. I just think it's incredibly powerful. No one position is right, but it really challenges our assumptions of the world, both the powerful visions and the very scary, chilling visions. So yes, thank you so much. Yes, please.
Thank you for your talk. I was really interested in the way that you talked about repetition.
Yes.
And so I'm curious about how repetition works differently in the problematic habit-forming everyday way versus how it works in ritual.
Yes. Yeah, wonderful question. And the answer is in the dangerous, from this point of view, everyday stuff. We don't realize we're simply repeating because we're repeating by rote, and we don't realize we're doing it. The repetition of ritual, on the contrary, is a training exercise. And let me just give you a couple of fascinating recent examples of this. So, Picasso, right? Picasso we tend to think of, and correctly tend to think of, as this extraordinarily innovative painter who by definition therefore is not repeating the past, he's doing something radically new, and he was a self-proclaimed modernist. So how did he learn to paint? He literally would take great works from the past, like Rembrandt's, and literally repaint them. Unbelievably difficult, I'm sorry, I should get close to the microphone, sorry. Unbelievably painstaking repetition of those paintings. But, as you can see from the example, here the repetition is training, right? He wasn't by naturally tossing out a Rembrandt. I mean, he was spending years learning how Rembrandt would sort of shift a brush right here to get that twinkle, how he would do this. So it's a repetition to train yourself to really sense the paint, sense the brush strokes. That's the repetition of ritual. Another example, a very telling one, you might have heard of Hunter Thompson. We call him the gonzo journalist because he's just this incredible writer who just would write these very, we think, spontaneous pieces. No, he was a very painstaking writer, and how did he learn to write? He took a novel he loved, which was The Great Gatsby, he retyped it. He typed The Great Gatsby because he wanted to figure out how the sentences worked. And to do them, he had to repeat it. He literally repeated it. This is the same work you're doing if you're learning calligraphy. You draw a line for a year. I mean, over and over again. And so it is repetitious, but it's the repetition of ritual. It's a ritual in which you are training yourself to really sense the world and act in the world and be skilled in the world, as opposed to the daily repetitions that we are just doing by rote. Great question, thank you. Yes, please.
So I think the pleasure's paid.
Yes.
And, coming up and seeing the light.
Yes.
And suddenly you've got this insight about how you're a prisoner to what's going on in the world, because everybody's at war somewhere or another. There was a war when Confucius was going on, and we've never not been at war in this country, etc., etc.
Indeed.
So it's like, how then does seeing the light, mobilize and change?
Yes, great question. And the answer they would give that I'm going to defend is this is why ritual is so important. This is why education is so important. Because even if, to stick with the example of Plato that I think you're absolutely right to bring up, even if you see the light, you just return to the same old patterns after seeing the light, and so does everyone else, and nothing changes. This is why, from this point of view, even if like you have a very tough familial relationship and you can finally sit down and have that good heart-to-heart and see the light for that brief moment, 2 minutes later you go back to the same old patterns. Nothing changes. It only changes through a curriculum where people are being, and I'll stick to that kind of chilling quote, but I think there's something powerful and challenging to it, where you're being submitted to ritual for a bit, right? I mean, that's what education is. You need an educational curriculum that is really challenging, breaking people from their normal ways of thinking, doing the equivalent of what they would call ritual. And I think that is the only way to do it. And that isn't, and that's just, let me quickly finish, and that's not just true at, say, the college level, it's true for lifelong learning. Like, if that is not going on all the time, even if, we reach the moment in Plato where we see the light, we will simply fade back to the same old patterns. Yeah, so please, yes.
So do you think one can grow insight?
Yes, I absolutely, and in fact, I'll even say, I think one can grow and continue to grow insight, right? And the reason I put it that way, it's one of the things that's very intriguing in the early Chinese tradition is they had a word called the sage. So the sage would be someone who putatively in every situation could flawlessly see all the patterns playing out, flawlessly see exactly what to do to shift those patterns, flawlessly see what trajectories things could be taken into to lead to worlds where people could flourish, flawlessly. The key is we'll never get there. And so you think of it as a lifelong work of trying to get there and always failing, which means, getting back to your question, you get ever more insightful, but you never get fully insightful. We'll die never being sages. We never will. So even Confucius' disciples would say, oh, come on, you're a sage, admit it. No, no, of course I'm not a sage, because that would mean I'm no longer training myself. So I think you gain ever more insight. We'll never be full sages. We'll never have flawless insight. But I absolutely think we can train ourselves to be better. Absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate your remarks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wonderful questions. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you and welcome to Tucson.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
So, how does one train themselves?
Yes.
Where do you jump off?
Yeah, great question, because, I mean, the truth is we don't have, role reversal rituals. And if you walk up to people saying, okay, let's do a role reversal ritual, I mean, they will not only blush, they'll laugh. I mean, so it wouldn't work. But let's begin at sort of the second stage in what they're talking about when they say, the goal is to reach a point where you're beginning to sense how to do this when there's no ritual telling you what to do, right? So what Confucius, just sensing what gesture to make, what tone of voice to use, what line of poetry to quote, even when there's no ritual telling him what to do. So if that's what we're trying to get to, then yes, it would be more helpful if we had rituals to help us do that. We don't. But what we have are lots of habits that we could make into rituals. And let me just begin with some absurdly mundane examples. But of course, they would say if we fall into these patterns at a mundane level, it's at the mundane level that we need to start working out of them. So here's a mundane example. You're walking down the street and you see someone you know, and you say, oh, hey, how's it going? And the other person goes, oh, pretty good, and then you walk on. Now, if you think about it, that's kind of an odd thing we do, because usually when you see someone and you say, how's it going? Oh, pretty good. Things probably aren't necessarily pretty good. They're probably going through a tough time, as we always tend to be. You're worried about this, anxious about that, the problem with a friend, blah, blah, blah. So you might think, well, we should be more sincere and tell people what we really think. Well, from this perspective, that isn't the solution either, because what we really think we don't really know, because it's so patterned. So what they would say is, it's a habit, make it into a ritual. In this case, very concretely, what this would mean is when you see someone, oh, hey, how's it going? Slightly change your tone of voice. just to experiment, because you don't know initially what your patterns are or what that person's patterns are. So, oh, hi, how's it going? Are things going okay? Hey, how's it going? Hey, hi, how are you doing? And you'll notice slight variations in how you phrase something brings out surprisingly different responses. You're getting on a bus and you say, oh, hi, good morning. You'll notice a little slightly different response. Say it slightly differently. You'll notice a different one. If that same bus driver is there day after day, you'll begin to sense that bus driver's moods. You'll begin to sense the little things you can do to help that bus driver, little things you can do to bring out different sides. And you get better and better at sort of sensing that. And think of that as the training. It's the equivalent of painting a Rembrandt, right? It's that daily work all the time. You start getting better and better at sensing things. So when you walk home and you tend to have a fight with a family member every day, do something slightly different than you normally do. And you'll notice a slightly, only slight, but a slightly different response. We're patterned creatures. And then you begin working on that. And you get better and better at sensing people for what they really are, which are messy people who have fallen into patterns, but whose patterns can be broken, just as ours can be. And that little work you're doing, just how you walk into a room, how you talk to someone, tones of voice, you'll be stunned at how different relationships are when you begin shifting those. And literally, like when you're talking about family relationships, within a few weeks they can begin altering. And you begin there at that really mundane level. You're doing the equivalent of painting Rembrandt. You're doing the equivalent of retyping The Great Gatsby. It's the repetition with slight variations to sense how things work, and then you keep going from there. That's what they mean by ritual. It's the training exercise of working with the world around you. And I know that sounds just ludicrously mundane, but they would say, but that's where it begins. That's where the patterns set in, have set in from a very young age. It's also where they begin to change. And I think they're profoundly right about that. Yeah, thank you.
You know you can drive your friends crazy.
Why can't you just stick with one tone of voice when you say hi?
With observation,
Yes.
essentially, we're talking about routine becoming ritual.
Yes, precisely.
And I'm reminded of a writer who was criticized for being so, sticking so much to routine. And he said, this is what I do every day in order so that I can go berserk in my work.
That's wonderful. Yeah, that is wonderful. Thank you. Yes, please.
Sure. Well, I was interested, and I think really I'm really honing in on exactly what you're saying. Another way to say it, I would say my own background more in the psychological, like the Western psychological traditions, but also wisdom, spiritual traditions.
Yes.
So we think about the word would be conditioned self.
Yes.
That comes out of our family, that we've internalized, and then we can cultivate a practice that gets us into something fresh, that we're not simply the present as if it were the past, but now is really where things live.
Yes.
And so initially when you were denigrating the true self, I was like, well, wait a minute. There is a self that's not conditioned.
Absolutely.
But you really do have to use ritual to get in touch with it.
Absolutely.
Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's beautifully put. Absolutely. That when we talk about this true self, again, it may be, and I think often is, just these patterns and habits we've fallen into, precisely. And the goal is to break down those. And then it's sort of, think of then the self as what you create out of that process, which indeed, as you said, could be defined as the true self. It's what you were creating by the way you were living your life then.
Yeah.
Which you were doing anyway, but you would actually be doing it creatively. Yes. Yeah, so beautifully put. Thank you. Yes, please.
The example you gave of the father-son role reversal was really a ritual of hierarchy.
Yes, yes.
Confucianism very much is within the family, within the state. But then you were talking about changing your patterns
Yes.
and being mindful of how you're relating to other people. And that sounds very Buddhist.
Yes.
So, which is also a kind of, well, you might call it a ritualization, but very loose ritualization. So how would you talk about the sometimes conflict, sometimes complementarity of Buddhism and Confucianism in China, and how does that apply to modern society, either in China, which is very much top-down now, and Western society, which is much more open, or tries to be?
Yes, beautiful. And so let me begin quickly with the final part of your question when you touched on China, and then use that to turn to various traditions in the Chinese past. So right now in China, absolutely. So I mentioned some of these very chilling theories that are all about how do you define an order that would become so rote and routine it would just become part of people's way of being. So this is part of what China is currently trying to do. Yes, and so they will correctly say they are building on a piece of the past. It's really the name of the way of thinking is usually called legalism, and they're very successfully building on that with certainly implications that many of us would find very frightening, using, by the way, algorithms they get from Google. So absolutely. Now, as needless to say, I think there are other traditions that are sort of the flip side of this. So if basically what legalism is doing is saying, if humans are like this, how do we keep them in these patterns so completely that they'll never break out of it? In other words, how do we create a world where there's nothing to break them? And what they're trying to do, very self-consciously trying to do, is to take out of the world anything that would allow that breaking to occur. And this finally gets to the heart of your question. That would include taking out what Confucians would call rituals, right, that are all about like creating these role reversals, breaks of perspective, etc. It's equally concerned with taking out all Buddhist practices, which are intimately involved in here too, trying to completely break these webs of relationships we create with our patterns. Now, the terminology is certainly different with significant implications, but in Buddhism, the way they would put it is, think of the world as a world of utter suffering that is created by our mode of being in the world. And that mode of being in the world we foolishly take as being so natural that we're not even aware of the suffering that we're creating. We're not even aware that we're literally creating suffering around us by our very way of being. And then the key for Buddhism is, how do you break that? How do you actually alter this and break that and break those webs of suffering that we are creating by the way we live our lives? And essentially what legalism is doing is saying, how do we create a world where it will never be broken? And let me just conclude on a kind of chilling side. I mentioned in passing, China is using these algorithms from Google. Here's where I'm particularly concerned about where things are going, among many concerns about where things are going in the current world. China's not the only one doing this. I mean, China's not the only one doing this. I mean, this is going on all over the place. I mean, states are realizing we can do this. Corporations are realizing we can do this. Institutions are realizing we can do this. And as this continues, and if it's allowed to continue to an even greater degree, we're going to create a perfect legalist utopia, which I would say would be among the most horrific dystopias we could imagine. And yet I think that's exactly where we're going. So yeah, thank you.
Watch allegory says it all.
Yes, no, I think it really does. It's like I chose this watch. No, I was manipulated into buying it. I mean, think of our lives that way. Think of our so-called political decisions this way. It's a very chilling world that we're allowing ourselves to fall into. Yes. absolutely. Yes, please.
Thank you, Michael. It's so happy to see you here in Tucson.
Oh, it's an
I think
honor to
at
be
Harvard,
here.
After Professor Duoming retired, right now you're carrying the torch, promoting Confucianism, spreading the good teachings of early China. And it's also very amazing to see you can develop the entire lecture based on just one phrase from Confucius Emulets, 克己复礼. So it's really very enjoyable to listening to all of that. So my question comes to two phrases you use quite often. You seems to suggest we've been forced, right, to accept a pattern. So I want to ask about being forced by what? By authority, by coercion, by consensus, and
Yeah.
a pattern. Where does it come from? I mean,
Yes.
the pattern has to come from somewhere. The fundamental question is this:
Yes.
Do you believe Confucius or Confucianism actually accept the free choice? Do I have the choice to walk away from this pattern? This is probably you read Herbert Fingerat's book,
Yes.
Secular as Sacred. That's fundamentally
Yes.
his question. So I would like to hear what's your opinion about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me begin with the first part of the question and then turn to the key second part, the heart of it. In terms of the first part of the question, and again, let me start with the scary stuff. If you look at the legalist tradition, so legalism is, again, this school of thought that's all about controlling people, and we often will read it, mistakenly read it, as being, oh, it's about creating authoritarian state structures that control people. That's accurate, but what's chilling about it is they will say, your goal is to create structures that people don't realize are authoritarian, that are controlling them. Because if they realize that, they'll resist. And they may succeed, they may not succeed, but if they're trying to succeed, they might, over time, break it. So if you create overtly authoritarian structures that are overtly controlling people, there will always be resistance. So the great theorists, like figures like Han Feize, the whole goal is to say, how do we simply create a world where people will simply do these patterns so totally, and nothing will ever break them from it, that yes, we'll actually make a very authoritarian state, but no one will think it. They will simply, no one will think it's authoritarian. They will simply think it's the world they're living in. It's just natural. They wake up, they do X, Y, and Z, they go to sleep, not realizing X, Y, and Z are things defined by the state to create a flawlessly efficient world for the state's interests. So the first part of the question, the patterns can come from just daily interaction, but the danger of a Google or an authoritarian state is they can actually use those patterns and keep us in them and just endlessly manipulate them. Now, that leads to the second part of the question. Can we choose, from a Confucian perspective, can we choose to walk away from this? No. And the reason I want to put it in a strong term no is part of what I find very powerful about this tradition of, I've been talking about ritual theory, but a number of other texts that we would later classify as Taoist would equally make the point I'm about to say, which is that vocabulary of I am choosing to walk away from these patterns. Be very wary, because as soon as we use that terminology, you need to ask, when I think I am doing this, who's the I here? Is it really who I think I am, or is it just a bunch of patterns? Is my choice a choice, or is it my kind of like my choice to buy a watch, simply something I'm being manipulated into doing? And when I am choosing to break these patterns, am I really, or am I really in a Han Feizian or Google world in which I'm simply being manipulated to do this, which is exactly what they want me to do, either to have me buy a watch or to have me click to vote in a certain way or to have me act in a certain way that will help the state. So in part of what I find powerful about these traditions is they are saying, question every single step in a sentence. I choose X. Who's the I? Are you really choosing? And what in the world is that X that you think you're choosing? And where did that X come from? So yeah, that's a beautiful way to end tonight's discussion. So let me just say thank you. Thank you all. These questions have been wonderful, and it has been such an honor to be here with you all tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.